Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, a midnight visitor leaves behind more than footprints. A knock echoes, a secret stirs, and one gentle mind will uncover what the darkness meant to hide. Where in the world are you listening from? Pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. It began, as such things so often do in St. Mary Mead, with something entirely ordinary, the church clock striking midnight and a curtain drawn against the chill. From her front parlor, Miss Jane Marple heard both. The chime rolled through the sleeping village, soft and self-satisfied, while somewhere beyond her hedge a latch clicked and footsteps pressed against the frost-hardened lane. She sat motionless in her armchair, the remains of her knitting pooled in her lap. It was not curiosity that held her still. Miss Marple was far too experienced for that, but rather the slow, instinctive pause of one who had learned that the smallest sound at the wrong hour often held a meaning. Across the green, a lantern bobbed outside the vicarage. A shape tall deliberately crossed the path toward the old almshouse. Then, as if noticing observation, it stopped. The light dimmed. The figure vanished. Miss Marple's lace curtains fell softly back into place. She would have thought little of it, had not the next morning brought such unwelcome company. By 9 o'clock, the village was properly awake, and with it, its tongue. Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to carry news, flapping into the grocer's with her shopping basket and indignation. Old Mr. Peake, the sexton, she said, had found the side gate of the churchyard open and a gentleman lying face down among the yews. Dead, though not long so. And not one of ours, she added with relish. Stranger clothes. London by the cut of them. Within an hour, the green was dotted with sensible boots and senseless theories. The colonel blamed tramps. The vicar murmured about misadventure. Mrs. Bantry, ever the dramatist, whispered of secret assignments gone wrong. Only Miss Marple remained quiet, shelling peas at her window, eyes narrowed slightly. The police arrived from Much Benema, a brisk young inspector with the faint air of one expecting rural dullness. His first question was to the vicar. Had anyone been expected late? Any guests? Any parish events? None, save Mrs. Clement's piano evening, which had ended before 11. The body, it seemed, was well dressed but carried no wallet or papers. Just one peculiar object, a small silver locket, badly scratched, containing a faded photograph of a child and a single pressed violet. The chain was broken. It was, as Miss Marple thought, the sort of sentimental trinket kept long past its natural purpose. By afternoon, the village was a hive of conjecture. Some swore they'd heard a motor car near the crossroads, others insisted on a quarrel by the post office. Yet under the chatter ran a current of unease. A stranger's death had entered their tranquil theatre, and everyone, quite unconsciously, had begun to perform. At tea, Miss Marple received her first visitor. It was Mrs. Clement, eyes anxious but voice brisk. "You do remember hearing something last night, Jane?" "Lights, perhaps? I only ask, because the inspector seems to think whoever it was came by the lane behind your garden." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Footsteps, yes. Just before midnight. A gentleman, I think, from the tread. But not in a hurry." Mrs. Clement leaned forward. "And you didn't see his face?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple said mildly, stirring her tea. "Only the manner of his walking. There was purpose in it. Not flight." When her visitor had gone, Miss Marple sat long in silence. Outside, the children of the village were daring one another to peer through the churchyard gate. The sound of their laughter carried oddly in the dusk like nervous bird song before a storm. On her mantel lay the day's newspaper, folded neatly beside her spectacles. A small headline in the London column caught her eye. Prominent solicitor missing after late departure from Paddington. Beneath it, a name she vaguely remembered from a trial some years past. She read it twice, folded the paper again, and placed it under the clock. That night, as the vicar's clock struck 12 once more, Miss Marple sat awake by her uncurtained window. Across the green, the churchyard slept beneath the frost. Only the lich gate creaked faintly in the wind, opening and closing as if remembering. And somewhere in that silence, she thought she heard again the slow, measured tread of a man who walked with purpose and never reached his destination. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of morning that made even the cockerels sound uncertain. From her window, Miss Marple watched the mist rising from the green, thinning around the church spire like a veil reluctantly lifted. Below, a constable was speaking to Mr. Peake near the lich gate, notebook poised, while the vicar hovered in worried attendance. It was almost unsettling to the parish's sense of order that death should arrive properly, in bed, with doctor and curate in attendance, not sprawled indecorously under the yews. By 9:30, the news had reached every breakfast table worth buttering. At the Blue Boar, the landlord was already repeating his version with adjustments suitable to each listener. To the butcher, he declared it a London man done in for debts. To the post-mistress, it was clearly a crime of passion she had, after all, noticed the stranger posting a letter the previous evening, though in truth no such customer had existed. Stories flourished faster than crocuses, and the truth, pale and delicateness, was quickly overrun. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement had already turned the parlor into a nerve centre. "We can't have speculation, Leonard," she insisted, while doing nothing to discourage it. "It gives the village such a dreadful impression." Yet even as she spoke, her eyes flicked toward the window each time a passer-by slowed. The need to appear unruffled was, to Mrs. Clement, as essential as faith itself. Miss Marple called upon her shortly before luncheon, ostensibly to return a borrowed gardening book. She was ushered in with warmth born of nervous gratitude. The tea tray was already set sure sign that Mrs. Clement had expected company. The vicar's wife poured tea as if performing a sacrament. "I do hope, Jane," she began in a low voice, "that you will say something to people. They listen to you. You're steadfast." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People will talk, my dear. It's rather like rain, it can't be stopped, only managed." Mrs. Clement sighed. Well, if only there weren't so many things to talk about. The poor man's death and that odd locket. The inspector seems to think it might have been torn from a woman's neck. Such dreadful implications. "Sentiment," murmured Miss Marple, stirring her tea. "And sometimes guilt dresses itself up as affection. I wonder which it was in this case." Her companion looked startled. "Oh, Jane, you don't think—" "I think," Miss Marple said mildly, "that people are rarely quite what they seem, particularly when they wish to appear respectable." The vicar entered then, looking harassed and slightly sanctified by duty. He greeted Miss Marple with genuine relief. "Ah, you've heard, I suppose. The inspector asked that we keep things quiet until an identification can be made, but that's quite impossible." Inevitably, Miss Marple agreed. Still, perhaps the less said, the fewer the errors. He nodded, clearly unconvinced. "They've taken the body to Much Benham for examination. I'm to hold myself ready for an inquest. Poor fellow. No papers, no money, only that trinket." Miss Marple rose after suitable condolences and walked home by the long way, through the village high street. The usual sounds of morning milk carts, school children, and the shop bell felt oddly fragile, as though the entire scene might dissolve if one stared too long. On the green, Mrs. Price Ridley and Colonel Melchett were already deep in discussion, each interrupting the other with equal satisfaction. Miss Marple caught a fragment as she passed. Knew it, you see. Always something odd about strangers walking by night. "Quite right, madam. A good Englishman stays indoors after 10 unless called by duty." They broke off to nod politely as Miss Marple passed. Respectability was a banner they both waved when fearful. At home, she found her housemaid, young Cherry, full of agitated excitement. "They say, ma'am, there wasn't any robbery at all." Mr. Archer from the inn told Constable Kent that the man's watch was still on him. "Silver, too. What sort of thief leaves that?" "The sort," Miss Marple said, removing her gloves, "who wishes the act to look like robbery without it being one." "I shouldn't repeat that, dear." Cherry flushed, caught between awe and confusion. "No, ma'am." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat again by her window. The frost was melting now, revealing the faint path that led from the back of her garden toward the churchyard. She followed it with her eyes to the hedge where the stranger's tread had faded into darkness. The snow there was faintly disturbed, though whether by rabbit or man she could not tell. Yet something about the direction perhaps made her uneasy. It led not from the main road, but from the smaller track that ran past Mrs. Bantry's cottage. She rose, fetched her shawl, and stepped outside. The air smelled of thaw and damp stone. Near the hedge she crouched, peering at the marks in the soil half-prints, irregular. The stride was long, assured, but the return steps there were none. Whoever had passed had not come back. Later that afternoon, as the shadows lengthened, Miss Marple took her customary walk toward the post office. Passing the vicarage again, she saw a motor car idling before the gate, a dark saloon with London plates. The young inspector stood beside it, conversing with a man in a heavy overcoat. They both looked toward the green, where the church tower rose impassively above the gossip below. Miss Marple did not linger. But as she walked on, she could not shake the thought that the stranger who had died so silently in the churchyard had perhaps not been quite alone. The broken chain, the missing half of a locket, it all whispered of connection, of something unfinished. And in a village like St. Mary Mead, unfinished things had a way of finding their conclusion. The next day brought an air of uneasy purpose to St. Mary Mead. The frost had softened overnight, leaving the lanes slick with thaw, and the police motor car outside the vicarage was now joined by a second larger, duller, and unmistakably metropolitan. From her front garden, Miss Marple noted the arrival with mild interest. City men, she thought, seldom improved matters in the country. They came expecting intrigue and left with indigestion. By mid-morning, Inspector Walsh of Scotland Yard had installed himself in the vicar's study, transforming it into a temporary command post. The vicar's books on moral theology were pushed aside to make room for police files and a typewriter that clattered with bureaucratic certainty. Walsh was a careful man, polite but brisk, with eyes that took in more than he allowed. He questioned the vicar, Mrs. Clement, and finally, as a matter of routine, Miss Marple herself. She was invited in with much apologetic ceremony, seated neatly beside the fire. The inspector regarded her with the courteous caution reserved for gentle old ladies who might unexpectedly prove sharp. "You heard footsteps, Miss Marple," he began. "Yes, Inspector. A man's, I think. Measured, unhurried. I could not see him clearly, of course. About midnight, was it?" "Just before. Our village clock is very prompt when it comes to midnight. I'm practically proud of it." Walsh smiled faintly. "You didn't recognize the voice or hear him speak?" "No, only the sound of purpose. I know it well. The same sound I once heard from a young man going to propose and another going to confess theft. There's a certain weight in anticipation or perhaps resignation." The inspector paused in his notes. "You've a sharp ear for the character, Miss Marple." "Merely a long one," she replied. "I've had many years to listen." He thanked her kindly, asked perfunctory questions about strangers seen in the village, and took his leave. Yet when she rose to go, she noticed his eyes return, unbidden, to the small clock on the mantel, a delicate piece of silver gilt incongruous among the vicar's simpler furnishings. "That clock," she said gently, "was a gift from Mrs. Bantry, I believe. She does have a fondness for ornament." Walsh blinked, then smiled. "Indeed. I admire your powers of observation." "Oh, not at all," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I only recall that Mrs. Bantry bought 2 such clocks at the jumble sale 3 years ago. The other went to the raffle table. I merely wondered who had drawn it. When she returned home, she found her neighbor, Mr. Arthur Bellamy, waiting at the gate. A retired bank clerk of mild disposition, Bellamy prided himself on keeping up with events. His spectacles gleamed with eagerness. "Shocking business, Miss Marple. Simply shocking. I just came from the inn." Apparently, the deceased had a railway ticket to Paddington in his coat pocket. "Return, mind you." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Then he intended to go back. Quiet, and no one seems to know why he came in the first place. No luggage, no appointments, not a soul expecting him. That's often the case with people who seek privacy, Mr. Bellamy. The fewer who know, the more successful the pretense." He frowned. "You think he came here to hide?" "I think," she replied, "that people rarely die far from their secrets." Bellamy, who disliked abstractions, looked flustered and retreated to safer ground. "Well, I do hope the police find whoever's responsible. It unsettles one, you know, being so near." That afternoon, the inspector made further inquiries around the village. He visited the post office, the Blue Boar, even the almshouses, collecting contradictions as easily as one gathered dust. Some claimed to have seen a motor car on the road from Market Belling. Others swore they'd heard a quarrel near the green. Each story bore the confident glow of fabrication. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a quiet call on Mrs. Bantry. The lady of Gossington Hall received her in a state of animated speculation, having already rearranged the narrative into something fit for luncheon conversation. "My dear Jane, it's perfectly obvious what happened. The man was meeting a woman. They quarreled perhaps over money, and she struck him down. One reads it constantly in the papers." "Yes," said Miss Marple, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Though in real life, I find people strike from fear more often than from anger." Mrs. Bantry fluttered. "You mean she didn't mean to kill him? Perhaps she meant only to silence him." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward a photograph on the mantel, Colonel Bantry, stiff and cheerful beside a prize-winning mare. In the corner of the frame, half hidden, was a reflection of a small silver clock identical to the one in the vicarage. "How curious," she murmured. "Jane." Mrs. Bantry looked up. "Oh, nothing at all, my dear. Merely admiring the framing." As she left, Miss Marple paused by the drive. 2 young constables were speaking quietly near the gate. One held a small evidence bag containing the locket. The violet inside had crumbled to dust. "It's odd," one said, "how something meant for love ends up beside a corpse." Miss Marple walked on, her steps deliberate. The symmetry of things, 2 clocks, 2 gifts, 2 paths through the snow, hovered uneasily in her mind. The pattern was forming, though its meaning remained elusive. By dusk, the inspector had taken rooms at the Blue Boar, the better to observe local comings and goings. The village, outwardly calmed, hummed beneath with a peculiar energy of concealed excitement. Curtains twitched, lamps glowed. Respectability wrapped itself around fear like a shawl. From her window, Miss Marple watched the lights blink out one by one. Only the vicarage remained lit, the silver clock gleaming faintly on its mantel as though measuring time for someone else entirely. She thought of the dead man's purposeful tread, of the violet pressed to dust, and of a promise perhaps long broken that had brought him to die beneath St. Mary Mead's yews. Then, as the church clock began to strike 10, a sound reached her, a single knock at the vicarage door, sharp and unexpected. The knock came again, more insistent this time, echoing through the stillness of the vicarage lane. From her darkened window, Miss Marple saw the vicar open his door a cautious inch. The lamplight behind him cast his silhouette long and uncertain against the frost. On the step stood a woman in a travelling cloak, her gloved hand poised mid-air as if undecided whether to knock once more. She was tall, rather striking, with the brittle elegance of someone accustomed to admiration, yet unaccustomed to cold. A brief exchange followed, too soft for words to carry, but the vicar's hesitation and the woman's trembling urgency spoke their own language. At last, the door opened wider, and she stepped inside. The light shifted, and the lane returned to silence. By morning, the event had become the village's most urgent question. Mrs. Price Ridley claimed she had seen a woman of questionable refinement arrive by taxi at 11 and vanish into the vicarage. Mrs. Bantry, determined not to be outdone, insisted she had it on good authority the visitor was a distant relation of the deceased man. Authority, in Mrs. Bantry's case, being her own instinct for melodrama. At the vicarage, however, truth and embarrassment mingled uneasily over the breakfast table. The mysterious woman had identified herself as Mrs. Lydia Carraway, is a widow, she said, from London, who believed the murdered man to be her cousin. She had come, by her own account, as soon as she read the description in the papers. Inspector Walsh found her explanation convenient but insufficient. You must understand, Mrs. Carraway, such identifications must be made formally. You claim the deceased is Mr. Leonard Eversham, solicitor of Hampstead? Yes, she said quietly. He was my late husband's partner for many years. Our families were close once. Her voice caught slightly on that last word, and Miss Marple, who had been allowed to sit in the corner as a harmless witness, noted how quickly the woman's hands resumed their composure afterward. Grief rehearsed rather than lived, she thought. Walsh closed his notebook. Then you can confirm it's him. I can. A pause. Though I cannot imagine what brought him here. The inspector leaned back. Nor can we. There's no business record, no appointment, no acquaintances. You're sure he had no local ties? Mrs. Carraway hesitated, just perceptibly. Not to my knowledge. He was private. Private men rarely end in churchyards, Walsh murmured. Someone must have known. The interview ended with the usual formalities, and Mrs. Carraway was invited to remain in the village until the inquest. She accepted, though her reluctance was thinly disguised. Lodging was arranged at the Blue Boar, where her arrival was greeted by a sudden hush and an impressive display of not staring from the assembled patrons. By noon, the tide of gossip had turned against her. She was, some said, too composed. Others found her mourning too fashionable. Mrs. Clement, torn between pity and suspicion, asked Miss Marple to tea to discuss the whole distressing matter. She looked so calm, Jane, Mrs. Clement whispered, not tearful at all, and her hands steady as stone. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, because she expected it. Mrs. Clement blinked. You mean she knew? I mean that people often rehearse their grief long before they wear it, sometimes years before. The vicar's wife considered this with an uneasiness bordering on fascination. Do you think the inspector suspects her? I think, Miss Marple replied gently, that Inspector Walsh suspects everyone in St. Mary Mead, which is as good a beginning as one could wish. That afternoon, Miss Marple ventured a small detour through the churchyard. The ground where the body had lain was now bare, save for a faint depression in the grass, like the memory of a weight. She noticed, not far from the yew, a single fragment of fabric caught on a thorn. It was fine wool, grey-blue, the colour of London smoke. She tucked it carefully into her glove. As she left the churchyard, she encountered Mrs. Carraway herself, emerging from the vestry where the inspector had briefly detained her for a further statement. Their eyes met. The woman paused, uncertain, then inclined her head with restrained courtesy. You are Miss Marple, I believe. Yes, my dear. A small place like ours doesn't keep secrets long. The widow's lips tightened. Then perhaps you know whether the remains will be taken soon. It's dreadful having them so near. There's comfort, perhaps, in proximity, Miss Marple said softly. Even an unhappy company is still a company. Mrs. Carroway looked startled, almost frightened, and turned away quickly. Yet as she walked off, her gloved hand reached instinctively for her throat as though checking for something absent. A chain, perhaps. That evening, Inspector Walsh paid a call on Miss Marple, claiming the need for local insight. She served tea, and he accepted with the grateful exhaustion of a man surrounded by riddles. "She's an odd one, Mrs. Carroway," he began. "No alibi for the evening, nervous as a cat, and yet I can't quite see her with a knife." "I should hope not," Miss Marple replied. "Knives require directness. Mrs. Carroway strikes me as a woman who prefers to undo things with silence." Walsh smiled ruefully. "Silence can be dangerous enough." "Indeed, especially when it hides guilt, but not always one's own." He looked up. "You mean she might be protecting someone?" "I mean," said Miss Marple, "that she might believe she is." They sat in a companionable quiet for a moment. The clock ticked with the steady calm of an old friend. Then Walsh rose to leave, thanking her with genuine warmth. As he stepped out into the dark lane, Miss Marple remained at her window, watching his lantern drift toward the Blue Boar. Across the green, Mrs. Carroway's window was lit, a faint shape visible at the curtains. The silhouette seemed still watchful. Behind her, the light of the vicarage flickered, as if restless. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the smallest detail. The reflection in the glass of her own window showed two faint points of light, perfectly aligned, one from the vicarage, one from the inn. Like mirrors facing one another across the square, each concealing a secret the other feared to show. The night lingered in the windows of St. Mary Mead like a thought that would not end. The two faint lights across the green, the vicarage and the inn, held each other in quiet defiance, as though some unspoken signal passed between them. Miss Marple, standing by her own window, noted it with the detached calm of one who has spent a lifetime watching human nature reveal itself through curtains. By morning, the thaw had deepened, and the lanes gleamed with pale mud. The church bell tolled once for morning prayers, though few attended. Respectability, Miss Marple knew, tended to stay indoors when scandal hovered. The inspector had begun his second round of questioning, but his manner, she thought, had subtly changed. There was less certainty in his tone now, and a hint of irritation and awareness that his London efficiency was being quietly defeated by small-town ambiguity. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Carroway sat in the parlor beneath a portrait of a former landlord, untouched tea before her, gloved hands folded with immaculate stillness. Her presence drew curiosity like a flame draws moth. Yet her expression, smooth as porcelain, betrayed nothing. At 11, Miss Marple ventured to the post office under the mild pretext of purchasing stamps. It was, conveniently, the center of all circulating information. The postmistress, Miss Hartnell, leaned across the counter as if sharing state secrets. "They've found something, you know," she whispered. "Down by the vicarage lane. The inspector came by himself this morning." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, sliding her coins forward with unhurried precision. "And what manner of thing was it?" "A piece of paper, half a letter, torn right through. The other half they haven't got, but you can still see writing, some of it smudged. I only caught a word or two when Constable Kent brought it in. 'Cannot forgive you,' it said. And then something about Wednesday night. Sounds quite dreadful, doesn't it?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Very dreadful. But words are so often less revealing than the manner in which they are written." She thanked the woman and went on her way, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Cannot forgive you." Such a phrase belonged less to fury than to wounded pride. And pride, in Miss Marple's experience, was the quietest killer of all. Passing the vicarage, she paused. The gate was ajar. Within, the vicar himself was pacing the path, his brow furrowed with fatigue. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, spotting her. "You've heard, of course." The inspector thinks the note may have been written by the dead man. He's comparing the handwriting. Has Mrs. Carroway seen it? Not yet. She's at the inn. The inspector means to ask her shortly. Terrible business. Miss Marple nodded gently, her eyes moving to the ground. Near the hedge, the damp soil bore faint tracks, 2 sets of footprints leading in different directions. One lighter, shorter. The other, perhaps a man, ended abruptly when the lane curved. There, caught in the brambles, something glinted. She stooped discreetly, feigning the adjustment of her glove, and freed it from the twigs. It was a button plain, dark but finely made. She slipped it into her pocket with quiet efficiency and straightened as though nothing had occurred. Terrible, indeed, she murmured. But then, truth so often is. Later that afternoon, Inspector Walsh came to call again, his expression somewhere between suspicion and weary admiration. "You have a good memory for details, Miss Marple," he said. "Would you happen to recall whether the deceased wore gloves?" "I recall his hands were not gloved when they found him," she said, "but one might have been lost. There are so many ways a hand can betray its owner, don't you think?" He regarded her for a moment as though trying to decide whether she was teasing him. Then he sighed. "We've shown the letter to Mrs. Carroway. She denied any knowledge of it, but she looked shaken. Said the handwriting wasn't his, but I'm not convinced." "Did she read the words aloud?" "No, she refused to." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Then she knows them too well." When he had gone, Miss Marple took from her pocket the button and laid it beside the small scrap of grey-blue cloth she had found by the yew tree. The stitching matched, her lips pressed together in a thin, thoughtful line. Whoever had stood there that night, whoever had spoken softly under the shadow of the churchyard, had worn a coat not unlike the one Mrs. Carroway had arrived in. Yet something still resisted the conclusion. The pattern was there, but the colours seemed wrong. A London solicitor, a widow with trembling composure, a letter of reproach too tidy, too moral, as if arranged for the comfort of gossip. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, rarely provided such symmetry. That evening brought a soft rain, turning the air to glass. Through her curtains, she saw the inspector again, striding toward the Blue Boar, his coat glistening under the lamps. Moments later, a different figure slipped from the inside door, a man in the innkeeper's apron, moving quickly toward the back lane that led behind the vicarage. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The village rarely slept. It seemed it merely pretended to. She drew her shawl closer and stepped outside. The rain muffled her steps as she crossed the green. At the bend in the lane, she paused. Voices low, tense reached her from the shelter of the trees. "Can't go on like this," the man said. "They'll find out." "Then let them," came the woman's reply, brittle and strained. "I've done nothing wrong. You know that isn't true." A silence followed, then a soft sob. Miss Marple, though she could see little, recognized the rhythm of desperation. It was not Mrs. Carroway who wept, but the innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Kent. The threads were tangling now, drawing unlikely people together beneath the same shadow. Miss Marple withdrew quietly, her shoes whispering against the wet path. The letter, the button, the chain, they were not clues in the ordinary sense. They were fragments of behavior, signs of emotion half expressed and half denied. Appearances, she mused, always polished themselves smoothest when truth grew rough beneath. When she reached her door, the rain had stopped, leaving the world smelling faintly of metal and earth. She hung her shawl to dry and stood for a moment by the hearth, her eyes on the small clock. Its hands trembled delicately toward midnight, the same hour the visitor had come. Outside from the church tower, an owl cried, once lonely, hollow, unanswered. And somewhere beyond the darkened inn, a woman's silhouette moved past a lighted window, her hand once again rising to her bare throat. The movement beyond the inn's curtain faded as the clock struck midnight, leaving the lane once again emptied of everything but its own silence. Miss Marple, still standing by her hearth, considered the faint glimmer of that silhouette, the same hand raised to the throat, the same pause of someone aware of being watched. It was not fear that lingered in the gesture, she thought, but remembrance, a reflex of loss rather than guilt. Morning brought the illusion of normality. The butcher's bell rang, milk clattered on doorsteps, and children resumed their noisy disputes near the green. Yet underneath it all lay a tension so thin and constant one could almost mistake it for the weather. People spoke in lowered tones, politeness sharpened into caution. St. Mary Mead had begun, in its own genteel way, to suspect itself. Inspector Walsh arrived at Miss Marple's cottage before breakfast, his hat slick with dew. "A curious development," he said, unbuttoning his coat. The letter found by the vicarage was written on paper from the Blue Boar. Same watermark, same stock. "The landlord swears it's common enough, but commonness," Miss Marple interrupted mildly, "is often the most convenient disguise." He looked faintly amused. "You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple. There's another matter, too. We've had word from London. The deceased, Mr. Evesham, was under investigation for embezzlement. Funds missing from his firm, and his partner, Mrs. Carroway's late husband, was thought to have covered for him years ago." "That explains a quarrel," said Miss Marple, "but not a journey to St. Mary Mead." Walsh nodded grimly. "Exactly. It seems he'd planned to meet someone here, perhaps to settle old debts, legal or emotional. But if it was Mrs. Carroway, she denies it. If it was someone else, they'd have kept silent." He rose to go, but hesitated at the door. "The innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Kent, is as nervous as a sparrow. I've seen her watching the inspector's car from behind the curtains. Do you think she knows more than she lets on?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that Mrs. Kent has seen something she wishes she hadn't, and something her husband would rather she forgot." Walsh studied her with quiet respect. "You'd have made a fine detective, Miss Marple." "Oh, my dear," she said, smiling faintly. "I am one, only unofficially." After he'd gone, Miss Marple wrapped herself in her shawl and went walking, following her usual circuit past the churchyard and the green. Her eyes, gentle and unfocused to the casual observer, missed nothing. At the gate of the Blue Boar, she encountered Mrs. Kent carrying a pail of water from the pump. The woman started visibly when she saw her. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "A fine day for washing." Mrs. Kent nodded too quickly. "Yes, ma'am. Always plenty to do. You must find the village rather lively these days. All this talk, all this interest. It can be quite overwhelming." Mrs. Kent's hands trembled. "I don't hold a conversation, ma'am. Talk ruins people." "Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed. "And sometimes it saves them if it's the right kind." She moved on gently, leaving the woman pale and unsteady in her wake. That kind of fear, she thought, was not born from guilt, but from the burden of knowledge. People in villages carried knowledge like a fragile dish too heavy to throw away, too valuable to confess. At noon, the inspector summoned Mrs. Carroway again, went to the vicarage for what he termed a clarification of timelines. Miss Marple, under the guise of offering moral support, was invited to sit in. The scene was one of polite unease. The widow in black, her gloved hands still immaculate, Walsh leaning forward with that mixture of courtesy and pressure that often made the truth tremble before it broke. "Mrs. Carroway," he began, "you stated that you came here after reading the paper yesterday morning, but your railway ticket the porter at Paddington remembers you boarding a train the night before. Care to explain that?" Her eyes flickered. "Yes, I travelled early. I couldn't sleep. I thought I might arrive before the crowds, before it became a spectacle." "Yet you didn't go to the police at once." "No, I was frightened." Walsh's tone softened. Of what? Her composure faltered, just for an instant. Of seeing him again, even dead. Miss Marple observed the woman's face with tranquil curiosity. There was genuine emotion there, yes, but layered over something practiced, like rouge on pale skin. The truth was present, merely veiled. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "may I ask, did the deceased have any correspondence among his effects?" Walsh frowned. Only that torn letter. And a small envelope of cash, £50 in notes. Oddly enough, it wasn't taken. "Then robbery was never the motive," Miss Marple said. "People don't carry cash so openly unless they intend to give it away." Mrs. Carroway looked sharply toward her. "You think he meant to pay someone?" "Oh, quite possibly. But money, like forgiveness, can be refused." A silence followed. Mrs. Carroway rose abruptly, gathering her coat. "I've told you all I can. I shall not be made a spectacle of this village." When she had gone, the vicar released a long sigh. "The poor woman, she looks ready to break." "Respectability cracks neatly," Miss Marple said, "like porcelain. But sometimes the cracks let the truth through." That evening, as dusk folded over the rooftops, the vicarage bell rang once more. This time it was the innkeeper, Mr. Kent, grim-faced and uneasy. "My wife's gone," he said. "Left a note. Says she can't bear the shame." "Shame?" Walsh demanded. "What shame?" Kent's jaw tightened. "She told me something she'd seen. I told her to keep quiet. She thought she'd done wrong." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And what was it she saw, Mr. Kent?" He swallowed. "A man near the churchyard that night. Not the one who died. Another. Waiting. When the stranger came up, they talked a bit. Then she got frightened and ran home. But she says she knew the second man's voice." "And whose was it?" Walsh pressed. Kent hesitated, eyes darting toward the floor. "The vicar's," he said finally. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the clock seemed to pause. Walsh's expression was unreadable. "That's a serious accusation." "I know," Kent muttered, but she swore it. When he had gone, Miss Marple stood by the hearth, her face unreadable in the flickering light. The vicar, poor Leonard, was the embodiment of probity, and yet, in her long experience, even virtue had its shadows. Appearances, she thought again, were a comfort one paid dearly to maintain. Outside, the rain began to fall once more, tapping softly against the window panes, and somewhere across the green, a door closed with deliberate care, as though someone were sealing away a secret that had grown too heavy to bear. The rain continued through the night, soft as breathing, erasing the edges of everything it touched. By morning, the village seemed freshly painted, washed, subdued, pretending that nothing had happened. But beneath that polite quiet lay the residue of the previous night's confession. The word vicar passed from one tongue to another, softened by disbelief, then sharpened by curiosity, until even the baker's boy whispered it like a prayer turned sideways. Miss Marple rose early. She had slept little, her thoughts circling the odd symmetry of events. 2 clocks, 2 letters, 2 women. Appearances repeating themselves like sins dressed in different clothes. She brewed her tea and sat by the window, watching the lane that led toward the vicarage. There were already muddy footprints at the gate Inspector Walsh's, she suspected, for the man was not one to let an accusation cool overnight. At 8:30, she saw him emerge from the vicarage with the air of a man who had listened to more than he wished to believe. The vicar followed him to the gate, pale and dignified despite the tremor in his hands. Walsh removed his hat, said something brief, then strode away toward the inn. Miss Marple gathered her shawl and went out. The air was sharp, threaded with the scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic, perhaps the remnants of rain on stone. She crossed the green, nodding to the vicar, who started slightly at her approach. "Good morning, Leonard," she said gently. "A dreadful business, I'm afraid." His voice was hoarse. "They questioned me for an hour. It seems my voice has been recognized by someone I've never met. I told them I was in the vestry until midnight, preparing Sunday's sermon." "And were you?" "Yes," he said too quickly. "At least, yes, I was for most of it. Then I went home by the back path. I saw no one." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "But perhaps someone saw you." He gave a broken laugh. "Good heavens, Jane, you sound like an inspector. You don't imagine." "I imagine nothing," she said kindly. "I observe. There's a difference." He smiled faintly, but the weariness in his eyes told its own story. Respectable men, Miss Marple thought, carried their secrets like prayer books held close, unopened, until the moment of crisis forced the pages apart. By mid-morning, the inspector was again at the Blue Boar, interviewing the widow. Miss Marple, passing on some pretext of visiting the grocer, glimpsed through the inn window the taut geometry of the scene, Mrs. Carroway in her black dress, Walsh leaning forward, the innkeeper hovering uncertainly in the background. Mrs. Kent's chair was empty. A few villagers lingered nearby, pretending to admire the flower boxes, though the geraniums were long dead. Miss Marple exchanged pleasantries, but her gaze kept drifting toward the side door, the one Mrs. Kent had used the night she vanished. There, near the sill, something faintly gleamed. She bent, feigning the adjustment of her umbrella, and saw it a sliver of torn paper, damp and faintly ink-stained. Only one word remained legible. Wednesday. She pocketed it carefully. Later, as she returned home, she found the inspector waiting by her gate. "You were right," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Kent's gone for good. We found her bicycle missing. And there's something else. Mrs. Carroway received a telegram this morning. I'm from London." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes sharpened. "And what did it say?" "She claims it's from her solicitor, but she wouldn't let me see it. Packed her bags and said she might have to return to town." "Leaving before the inquest?" Miss Marple asked softly. "That's rather hasty." "Exactly my thought. I've stationed a man on the road to Much Benham in case she tries to slip away. Still, I can't hold her without cause." "Cause," Miss Marple mused. "It's such a flexible word, don't you think? One can have cause for murder, for mercy, even for silence." He gave a tired smile. "If I had your philosophy, Miss Marple, I'd never make an arrest. If you had mine, Inspector, you might make fewer mistakes." Their eyes met for a brief moment of understanding. Then he tipped his hat and left her to her thoughts. That afternoon, Miss Marple called at the vicarage with a small basket of scones, the universal currency of comfort. The vicar's wife opened the door with a look of strained civility that failed to hide her exhaustion. "Oh, Jane," she said, "I'm so glad you've come. Leonard's dreadfully upset. This whole talk of his voice, he hardly slept." Miss Marple's expression was serene. "Guilt and innocence can look much the same in daylight, my dear. Tell me, do you happen to know whether the vicar lent out the church key lately?" "The church key?" "Why, yes, last week. To Mr. Kent. He was repairing the hinge on the south door." Miss Marple nodded. "Ah, I thought as much." Mrs. Clement frowned. "Why is that important?" "Oh, I'm not sure it is," said Miss Marple, setting the basket down. "But hinges, like people, can tell interesting stories once loosened." She took her leave shortly after, strolling slowly across the green. Her mind was turning over small, precise details, the missing bicycle, the torn paper, the hinge. All little, things insignificant until one realized they were all connected by absence. A chain broken, a button lost, a voice misheard. The pattern of what was missing told more than what remained. As she reached her cottage, a motor car came rattling down the lane, sending the crows scattering from the trees. It was Constable Kent, hat askew, face pale. "Miss Marple." "The inspector says come quick." There's been another. He stopped himself, swallowed. Another body. Down by the mill road. A woman this time. Her knitting bag fell from her hand, spilling grey wool onto the path. "Mrs. Kent?" she asked quietly. He nodded. The rain had begun again by the time they reached the site. The body lay half hidden beneath a tangle of reeds, the bicycle nearby. No sign of struggle, only stillness in the faint reflection of her face in the pooled water. The inspector stood a few yards away, grim and wordless. "Drowned?" Miss Marple asked. "Looks like it," he said. "But there's something odd. No mud on her shoes, and the water's barely 3 feet deep." She looked down at the woman's still form, her hair streaming like riverweed. 3 feet can drown the guilty and the innocent alike, she murmured. But this wasn't despair, Inspector. It was an arrangement. He glanced at her sharply. "You mean someone?" "I mean someone wanted her silence to look respectable." She turned toward the lane where the church tower loomed against the low sky, its bell silent as judgment. Somewhere between the vicar's confession and the widow's calm, a hand had chosen to tidy up the story, and Miss Marple, for all her gentleness, could not abide a lie disguised as decency. The inspector called for the constable to fetch a stretcher. Miss Marple remained by the water's edge, her eyes tracing the ripples that spread outward and dissolved. The reeds swayed once, then stilled. Behind her, Walsh's voice carried faintly through the mist. "Do you think it's connected?" "Oh, yes," she said softly, almost to herself. "In St. Mary Mead, everything always is." And as she turned away, she saw something glimmering beneath the water, a fragment of metal catching what little light the sky offered. A chain link, broken clean through and caught between 2 stones like the hinge of an unspoken truth. The surface of the mill pond stilled as the constables lifted the stretcher, leaving behind a pale ring of ripples that spread outward, wider and fainter, until they merged with the reeds. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her gloved hands folded, her face calm in a way that drew attention away from the alertness in her eyes. The chain link glimmered once more as it was dislodged from the mud, then sank again, invisible. It would wait, as truth always did, until someone bothered to look closely. Inspector Walsh turned from the scene, fatigue etched into the lines of his face. "She was silenced," he said quietly. "I'll swear to it. But I can't make the pieces fit. The vicar denies everything, Mrs. Carraway's gone back to her room at the inn. And the Kents, well, there's no one left to question now." "There is always someone," Miss Marple replied softly. "Usually the person least anxious to be asked." Walsh gave her a wry look. "You've someone in mind, I suppose?" "I have several. The difficulty is not whom to suspect, Inspector, but how to persuade the guilty to speak when confession would spoil their reputation." He frowned. "You make it sound like a moral puzzle." "It usually is," she said. "Murder is rarely born of passion, you know. More often it's the offspring of embarrassment." They walked back toward the green. The village, despite its composure, seemed to be holding its breath. Curtains fluttered and fell doors opened just enough to let whispers escape. By the time they reached the Blue Boar, word of the drowning had already spread. Mrs. Carraway was seated by the fire, still in mourning black, her gloved hands resting on a suitcase. She looked up as they entered, not startled, but wary. "I was about to leave," she said, her tone carefully measured. "The noise, the attention, it's intolerable." "I'm afraid you'll have to postpone your journey," Walsh said, taking the chair opposite her. "There's been another death." Her eyes flickered, just briefly. "The woman from the inn?" "Yes. Drowned, apparently, or made to look so." Miss Marple, standing near the mantel, watched her closely. The widow's composure was remarkably steady, as though she'd already prepared for every question. Walsh continued, "You knew her, I believe." "Only in passing. She and her husband had something to hide. He admitted his wife saw someone near the churchyard the night of the murder. Mrs. Carraway's hands tightened on her gloves. "And you think it was me?" "I think she saw someone she recognized," Walsh said evenly. "That's not quite the same thing." Miss Marple's voice came gently from the hearth. "Mrs. Carraway, forgive an old woman's curiosity, but the locket found on Mr. Evesham did once belong to you?" The widow hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, years ago. It was a gift. We were close once. My husband knew nothing of it. I had forgotten it existed." "Until it reappeared," Miss Marple said. "That must have been quite a shock." "It was," the woman admitted, her voice trembling now. "But I didn't kill him, if that's what you mean. I came here because of his letter. He said he wanted to see me to confess something about the past." Walsh's eyes narrowed. "You never mentioned that before." "I was ashamed," she whispered. "I thought people would misunderstand." Miss Marple's expression was kind, but her mind ticked quietly forward. Shame, again. The same thread weaving through every life in this tidy village, shame dressed as virtue, deceit disguised as silence. But to pull that thread, she needed more than deduction. She needed human weakness. That evening, as the inspector prepared his formal statements, Miss Marple asked for the use of the vicarage, parlor. "There's a small matter I'd like to resolve," she explained, "and a test of sorts to confirm what I already suspect." Walsh, by now half persuaded of her uncanny precision, agreed reluctantly. "Just don't get yourself into trouble," he muttered. "Oh, I never do," she said pleasantly. "Other people, alas, often do it for me." By dusk, the room was arranged with lamplight softened, chairs drawn close, tea prepared. She invited 3 guests, the vicar, pale but composed Mrs. Carraway, quiet and tense, and Mr. Bellamy, the retired clerk who had taken such a lively interest in the proceedings. Walsh lingered near the door, a silent witness. Miss Marple began in her usual conversational tone. "It seems to me that everyone in St. Mary Mead has tried very hard to appear respectable this week, and yet, as any gardener knows, soil disturbed by concealment never quite looks the same again. One need only look closely." Bellamy shifted uneasily. "If this is about gossip—" "Oh no, dear Mr. Bellamy. Gossip is imaginative. I prefer observation. For instance, the vicar's south door hinge recently mended. Yet the man who borrowed the key never returned it. Mr. Kent, wasn't it?" The vicar nodded uncertainly. "Yes, but when Mrs. Carraway arrived, she came not by morning train, as she said, but by the last one before midnight. There was enough time for her to reach the churchyard unseen. Yet she did not meet the man she expected. Someone else intercepted him." Mrs. Carraway's voice quivered. "You think it was me?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that you are not the only one he wrote to. A second letter was sent to someone he trusted less, but feared more." The silence deepened. The clock ticked with unreasonable clarity. "Mr. Bellamy," Miss Marple said softly, "you worked in a bank. You would recognize the signs of a man preparing to flee with money, £50 in notes, no papers, no luggage. Curious, isn't it? Almost as though he were carrying payment, not possession." Bellamy's color drained. "This is absurd." "Perhaps. Yet the torn note found by the lane was written on blue bore paper, and you, I believe, spend many evenings there. You also told Constable Kent that the man's watch had not been stolen. But that information was never made public. How could you have known?" The room froze. The vicar's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer. Mrs. Carraway's gaze darted between them, fear widening her eyes. "Well, I must have heard it somewhere," Bellamy stammered. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "You saw it yourself, didn't you? You met him that night near the churchyard. He meant to give you the money to cover what you'd stolen long ago from your own bank, but shame makes poor negotiators. You quarreled. You struck him down, and when Mrs. Kent saw you, you silenced her too, not with anger, but with arrangement. Bellamy rose, trembling. You've no proof. Not yet, she agreed. But proof has a way of turning up like the rest of a broken chain. Walsh stepped forward, laying a firm hand on the man's shoulder. I think that will do, sir. Bellamy sank back into the chair, the defiance gone from him. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea with the composure of someone folding the last corner of a completed puzzle. Yet as the inspector led him away, her gaze drifted to the window where rain had begun again. Gentle but relentless. There was pity in her eyes, but no surprise. People, she thought, were much like the weather, capable of great calm before the inevitable fall. Then, from the corner of the room, a faint sound broke her reverie, the creak of the hinge on the south door, opening and closing in the wind. The door's low creak lingered in the silence after Mr. Bellamy's removal, its plaintive sound mingling with the patter of rain against the vicarage windows. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting untouched in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the wavering lamplight. It was not satisfaction that marked her expression, but the steady contemplation of a woman who had seen too many tidy endings come apart at the seams. For tidy, she knew, was merely another form of deceit. Inspector Walsh re-entered quietly, his boots damp, his manner more subdued than usual. They've taken him, he said. He confessed enough to make the rest unnecessary. Claims it was an accident, one push, nothing more. Evesham threatened to expose him over old accounts. He rubbed his temples, a mess of pride and panic. Miss Marple's hands folded neatly. Yes, accidents are very often the final refuge of the respectable. Walsh gave a short, humorless laugh. You don't seem surprised. No, she said. Only sorry. Mr. Bellamy's tragedy is the simplest kind. He believed virtue could survive secrecy. The inspector poured himself a cup of tea and sat, watching the rain trace silver threads across the window. There's still the matter of Mrs. Kent. I suppose you think that, too, was an accident. Oh, no, Miss Marple said softly. Her death was deliberate, but not cruel. She was silenced by someone who thought kindness could be mistaken for mercy. Walsh looked at her sharply. You mean Bellamy? I mean, she said, that guilt in such men is curiously considerate. He could not bear a woman's conscience wandering loose through the village. So he anchored it in the pond. Walsh stared at her a long moment before sighing. I suppose you'll tell me it all fits now. Not quite, Miss Marple murmured. There is still one more hinge that doesn't close. He frowned. What hinges? The south door, she said, rising. Would you mind accompanying me to the church, Inspector? I find that moral architecture tends to reveal itself most clearly in places of prayer. The rain had eased into mist by the time they reached the churchyard. The yews whispered faintly, their branches heavy with moisture. Walsh unlocked the gate, his torch cutting narrow paths of light through the gloom. The church loomed above the ancient stone, steadfast but faintly shivering in the wind. Miss Marple led the way to the south door, pausing to trace her fingers along the new hinge. See how freshly oiled it is, she murmured, and yet the lock is still stiff. Mr. Kent mended it, yes, but someone else used it since. There's mud on the threshold from the same soil as the mill pond. Even the church keeps its secrets. Walsh crouched, inspecting the marks. You think Bellamy came this way? Not only Bellamy. She stepped inside, her small lamp sending soft gold across the pews. There were two here that night, the stranger and the one who feared him. But there was a third who followed the one who saw everything and understood too much. He straightened slowly. You mean the vicar? Not in the way you think. Her eyes moved toward the chancel, where the faint gleam of brass reflected their light. He was here indeed, writing his sermon, but he heard more than he should have. The quarrel, the fall, and afterwards, the sound of a man's prayer spoken through tears. The vicar has carried that confession in silence ever since, mistaking secrecy for salvation. A movement stirred in the shadows near the altar. The vicar stepped forward, pale, composed, the collar of his coat turned up against the damp. "You knew," he said simply. "I wondered how long before you'd come." Walsh turned, startled. "Reverend, please," the vicar interrupted, his tone quiet but steady. "It's all true. I heard them, Mr. Bellamy and the stranger. When I reached the door, it was already done. Bellamy begged me to help him. He said it was an accident. God forgive me, I believed him." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And so you hid the truth. You thought to shield him for the sake of his soul." The vicar's voice trembled. He was a good man once. "I thought repentance would follow, but when Mrs. Kent came to me when she said she'd seen him by the gate, I knew it was too late. And still I said nothing." Walsh exhaled heavily. "You realize, sir, this complicates matters." "I do," he said, "but perhaps confession should never be simple." Miss Marple's gaze was kind. "You did what many call righteous, but righteousness is a poor substitute for truth. Appearances comfort the living, but they seldom save them." The vicar lowered his head. "I'll make my statement." Walsh hesitated, then nodded. "It's best that way." They left the church together, locking the south door behind them. The mist had thinned, revealing the faint outline of dawn's fragile line of silver edging the horizon. The air smelled of wet stone and candle wax, mingled with something else, release perhaps, or the weary echo of justice finding its voice. At the gate, Walsh turned to Miss Marple. "You saw it all before any of us did, didn't you?" "Even the motive?" She smiled faintly. "When one spends a lifetime observing tea tables and parish quarrels, one learns that the most dangerous emotion in the world is not hatred, Inspector. It's embarrassing. Hatred kills cleanly. Embarrassment festers until it must be buried or drowned." Walsh gave a low chuckle. "I'll never look at our church pond the same way again." "Nor should you," she said. "Respectability reflects beautifully on the surface, but there's always a bit of silt beneath." They stood for a moment in companionable silence, watching the grey light gather above the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. Then the inspector turned toward the station, his figure fading into the mist. Miss Marple remained by the gate a while longer, listening to the slow drip of rain from the yew branches. Somewhere across the green, a shutter opened the village, waking to yet another day of propriety, its conscience carefully ironed and folded. She looked back once at the church tower, its clock face dim in the dawn. The chime would soon sound 7, another hour to mark, another secret laid to rest. And yet, even as peace returned, she felt that faint, familiar melancholy, the knowledge that human nature, for all its repentance, would always find new ways to disguise itself. When she turned for home, the mist closed gently behind her like the final page of a book. The mist folded behind her as Miss Marple crossed the green, the first pale notes of dawn drifting from the church tower. She moved with quiet purpose, her small figure merging with the slow rhythm of morning, the milk cart rattling, a dog barking distantly, shutters creaking open on houses that pretended not to know what had passed in the night. St. Mary Mead was already composing its latest scandal into something suitably dignified. At her gate, she paused. A sparrow fluttered from the hedge, startled by her step. The garden smelled of damp earth and lilac leaves, a fragrance faintly bruised by rain. Inside, the clock in her parlor chimed the hour. It sounded comfortingly domestic, as though reminding her that life, however darkened, insisted on proceeding. She lit the fire, brewed tea, and set out 2 cups without thinking of habit, not hope. For years she had kept an extra cup for those who needed one, a flustered neighbor, a fretful maid, or, on rarer mornings, a weary inspector. The village always came to her eventually, like threads drawn back to a spool. Not long after, there came the soft crunch of boots outside. She smiled faintly as Inspector Walsh appeared at the window, hat in hand, face drawn but composed. She waved him in. He accepted her offer of tea without protest. "It's over, then," he said, seating himself near the fire. "Bellamy will be charged." The vicar's statement clears up what little remained. It's a sad business, no villains, only people trying too hard to stay decent. Miss Marple nodded. "That's often the trouble with decency, Inspector. It tempts people into concealment. Sin, at least, is honest." He looked at her with reluctant admiration. "You see things in such strange ways." "I see people," she replied mildly. "They seldom surprise me, though they still manage to sadden me." Walsh took a long sip of tea. "The coroner's satisfied? We'll tidy things up quickly. Mrs. Carroway leaves on the afternoon train to give evidence at the inquest, but I don't expect much more from her." "She's endured enough," Miss Marple said quietly. "The dead have finished with their reputations. The living must still guard theirs." The inspector smiled faintly. "I'd say you're the most dangerous mind in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple." "Oh, my dear," she said, folding her hands. "Dangerous people are rarely old ladies with knitting. They're the ones who hide behind respectability, telling themselves they're good." Walsh glanced toward the window. The morning light was brightening now, revealing the glint of puddles on the green. "You think this village will forget?" "Forget? Never. But it will be remembered politely, in half-truths and softened phrases. Mr. Bellamy will become poor Bellamy. Mrs. Kent, a nervous woman. The stranger will be reduced to a moral something about the dangers of secrets. St. Mary Mead is very good at forgiveness, provided the story fits on a teacup." He chuckled softly. "And you?" "Oh, I shall remember differently," she said. "Not the act, but the cause. Shame, Inspector, it seeps into every drawing-room sooner or later." He rose to go. "You've done me a service, Miss Marple. Scotland Yard will never put it in writing, but we owe you one." She smiled. "Just keep an open ear for human nature, and we'll be even." When he left, the quiet of the cottage deepened. The clock ticked, the kettle hummed, and beyond the window, the village resumed its small, determined life. Miss Marple carried her teacup to the armchair by the hearth, where her knitting lay waiting, half-finished. The grey wool looped through her fingers, steady, certain. Her thoughts wandered not to Bellamy or the vicar or even Mrs. Carroway, but to the stranger who had walked so purposefully down the lane that night. What had he thought, she wondered, in those final moments before the quarrel? Perhaps he had imagined redemption, perhaps only closure. Either way, he had sought peace and found only the terrible neatness of concealment. Outside, the village children were already playing on the green. Their laughter rose like birdsong, incongruous and innocent. Miss Marple watched them through the lace of her curtain, her gaze tender but grave. It was always the same innocence renewing itself while the adults arranged their polite ruins. A knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Clement standing there, her hat askew, eyes uncertain. "Jane," she said breathlessly, "is it true then? About poor Mr. Bellamy? Leonard won't tell me properly." "It's true, my dear," Miss Marple said. "He acted out of fear, not malice. That makes it no less tragic, but perhaps more understandable." Mrs. Clement clasped her hands. "How dreadful. And such a quiet man." "I never would have thought no one ever does," Miss Marple said gently. "That's what makes us all so dangerous." The vicar's wife lingered, twisting her gloves. "Leonard's very troubled. He feels he failed somehow, as if he ought to have stopped it." "Conscience is an odd creature," Miss Marple murmured. "It often wakes too late, then refuses to sleep again." Mrs. Clement gave a faint, grateful smile. You always make it sound less terrible. I only try to make it true." After her visitor had gone, Miss Marple stood for a long moment at the door, breathing in the scent of rain-washed air. The church bell struck 10, clear and measured. Across the green, the Blue Boar's sign creaked gently in the breeze. The inn would fill again by evening, and new stories would replace the old. The pattern would repeat, as it always did. She turned back inside. The fire had burned low, the room dim with the soft golden haze of late morning. On her table lay the scrap of grey-blue fabric she had found by the yew tree. She picked it up, folded it neatly, and placed it in a small drawer among her keepsakes, stark tokens of other tragedies, each once whispered about, each now forgotten. Her knitting resumed, the steady rhythm of the needles matching the quiet pulse of the house. In the distance, the vicar's organ began to play tentative at first, then fuller, the sound carrying through the open window like forgiveness, finding its form. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. The melody wove through the air, fragile and human, much like the village itself, flawed, harmonious, endlessly repeating. When she looked again, the sky had cleared and sunlight spilled across her rug, turning the grey wool silver. She smiled faintly and reached for her teacup. Life, she reflected, was rather like knitting the pattern only made sense when viewed from a distance, and mistakes, once noticed, could never quite be undone, but one carried on all the same. Outside, the sparrow returned to the hedge, shaking its feathers free of water. The day continued, ordinary and unrepentant,